Welcome back to the deep dive. Before we jump into today's material, I want to take a quick second to ask you to please like and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, please do. It really does help.
It makes a massive difference for us. I also want to highly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the ebook we are exploring today. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. Seriously, take a moment to hit subscribe on his Substack.
It's definitely worth picking up your own copy on Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks because, well, the source material today is incredibly dense. We're really only going to be able to scratch the surface of the underlying data he presents.
Right. So let's get right into the mission for today. We are taking on an extensive forensic analysis of Conrad Riker's provocative 2025 ebook. And the title is a mouthful, but it establishes the entire framework from page 1. It's called Satanic, Catabolic Field, Feminist, Marxist, Postmodernist, Woke Mind, Virus, Field Phenomena, Killing Western Civilization.
Yeah, it is a massive, highly structured piece of literature. And the title itself is almost a warning label for the sheer volume of institutional critique contained inside.
I want to frame this right up front as an absolute must-listen deep dive for anyone out there, especially men who might consider themselves part of the manosphere or those who are deeply interested in men's rights and advocacy.
Absolutely.
If you have ever wanted to deeply understand the history and the internal mechanics of how modern institutions operated before they were, in the author's framework, captured by feminists and Marxists, this deep dive is for you.
Because the book provides a distinctly red-pilled lens on reality.
Exactly. The central argument here is that Western civilization is being actively consumed from the inside out. Whether you're looking for a diagnosis of the modern corporate and academic world, or you simply want to understand the architecture of the cultural awakening happening right now in private digital networks, this book is an ultra-long, incisive, and truly fascinating read that you will definitely want to buy.
But before we get into the weeds of these chapters, we need to offer a brief, very clear impartiality disclaimer.
Yes, very important.
As always, we act as your impartial guides through the source material. We are not endorsing the viewpoints presented in the book.
Nor are we condemning them.
Right. The content we are analyzing today is highly polarizing, it's politically charged, and it challenges a lot of mainstream narratives. Our job is simply to impartially unpack the original text.
We're just here to convey the exact ideas, arguments, and evidence that Conrad Riker has put forward. We are dissecting the text objectively, analyzing its internal logic, and mapping out its worldview for you, the listener.
So we're just laying out the blueprint he drew.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the foundational metaphor of the entire book, which revolves around this concept of the catabolic field, and what the text refers to as the satanic inversion.
Heavy terms.
Very heavy, very aggressive terms. Let's break down how the book defines catabolic.
What's fascinating here is that the author borrows a concept directly from cellular biology to explain macro-level cultural decay.
Okay, so biological catabolism.
Right. In biology, catabolism is the set of metabolic pathways that break down molecules into smaller units to release energy. When a body is starving, or when it is fighting a severe wasting disease or a tumor, it enters a catabolic state. The body begins to literally digest its own healthy muscle tissue to survive, or in the worst case scenario, to feed the tumor that is killing it.
So it's an organism cannibalizing its own structural strengths just to sustain a localized disease.
That is the exact parallel the book draws. The argument is that this biological process is happening to Western civilization on an institutional level.
Interesting.
In this framework, leftist dogma, specifically the synthesis of feminism, Marxism, and postmodernism, acts as the tumor. And the muscle that is being actively consumed and broken down to feed that ideology is male potential, male agency, and the accumulated intellectual capital of the West.
What?
The text describes a self-consuming system that feeds on traditional Western values like meritocracy, logic, and objective truth, all while presenting itself under the guise of progress. The author writes that this phenomenon isn't a reform movement. He says it is active sabotage.
And he pairs that biological metaphor with this other overarching concept, the satanic inversion. Now, I have to admit, when I read the word satanic in the title, I thought we were getting into literal theology. How is he actually using that word here?
It's a crucial distinction to make. The text uses satanic not in the sense of literal pitchforks and horns.
Right.
It's used in a philosophical, almost Gnostic sense. It refers to the absolute rejection of reality and the inversion of the natural order. The claim is that modern society has completely flipped the definitions of good and evil, of strength and weakness.
So up is down, right is wrong.
Exactly. The book argues that our current institutional system now actively rewards narcissism, victimhood, and emotional irresponsibility, while it systematically punishes competence, stoic duty, and raw honesty.
I want to ask you, the listener, to consider this framing as you look at the media landscape. Think about how often emotional instability or public breakdowns are rewarded as authenticity or bravery in modern culture,
Oh, all the time.
while calm rationality or stoicism is viewed with deep suspicion, often labeled as toxic or repressed. This is the exact cultural frequency the book is tuning into.
And the text provides very specific markers for this inversion. A primary example is how objective truth is increasingly treated as hate speech, while an individual's emotional narrative, what is often referred to as their lived experience, is elevated to the status of unassailable truth.
Right, the lived experience trumps the data.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of historical movements, the author argues that traditional Marxism, which focused on the class struggle between workers and owners, fundamentally failed to take root in the prosperous West.
Because the economic wedge just didn't work.
Right. So academics repurposed the struggle into a gender and identity conflict. The new proletariat is no longer the working class, it is an alliance of women and minority identities.
And the new bourgeoisie, the oppressors, are men.
That's the argument.
The text takes that a step further by pointing out a fascinating contradiction about this new proletariat. The new revolutionaries in this cultural Marxism don't actually labor in the traditional physical sense.
No, they don't.
They don't build bridges or farmland or lay fiber optic cables. They govern, they administer. We are talking about DEI bureaucrats, HR managers, university administrators, and trust and safety councils. They don't build the infrastructure of society. They police the behavior of the people who do.
The argument is that this administrative class extracts resources from the productive elements of society to fund their own policing of those same elements.
It's a closed loop.
And they do it under the banner of inclusion, while systematically excluding anyone who challenges their specific dogma. The satanic inversion in this context is the flipping of reality so that male biology and masculine traits, competitiveness, aggression, stoicism, are treated as a sort of original sin.
A pathology that requires perpetual management and atonement. This transitions perfectly into the actual mechanics of how this capture is achieved, because the book makes the case that this isn't happening through physical force or military conquest. It's happening through the re-engineering of communication itself. Let's get into what the author calls the language plague.
This is an incredibly robust section of the book.
The premise here is that language is being altered not to help us understand the world with more clarity, but to deliberately obscure reality and exert social control.
The author quotes a prominent feminist sociologist who stated, "Alter the grammar and you alter the mind." The text views this as a deliberate strategy of linguistic castration aimed at Western thought. And to ground this in data, the book cites a 2024 MIT study.
This study blew my mind.
Yeah, linguists analyzed 12,000 newly coined terms within the fields of sociology, gender studies, and critical theory.
12,000 new terms. That is a staggering amount of academic jargon to inject into the cultural bloodstream in such a short period of time. Just think about what it feels like for a college freshman stepping into a lecture hall and being hit with a completely foreign, highly weaponized vocabulary.
And the findings of that MIT study are telling. The researchers concluded that 68% of those new terms were designed not to clarify concepts, but to actively obscure them.
Wow, over 2/3.
The author uses the phrase heteronormative cis-patriarchal gaze as a prime example. The argument is that a phrase like this doesn't expand human understanding, it collapses it into ideological compliance.
It's basically an academic password.
Exactly. These words act as barriers to entry. They are essentially verbal spells designed to shut down logical debate, because if you don't use the approved terminology, you are immediately disqualified from the conversation.
It's a way of rigging the game before the debate even starts.
Yeah.
And the book points out how this goes beyond just adding confusing new nouns to the dictionary. The actual structure of sentences is being policed to erase male agency.
The syntax itself is being targeted.
Right. There's a fascinating dive into a 2023 internal directive from the BBC. According to the text, the BBC quietly directed its writers and journalists to avoid using active verbs when describing the historical accomplishments of men.
That specific example really highlights the subtle power of syntax. The text notes that instead of writing a clear sentence like, "he built the house," the BBC directive suggests phrasing it in the passive voice.
So something like, the house came into being.
Yes. And the author points out that this seemingly minor grammatical shift completely removes the actor, the effort, and the agency from historical record. It creates a passive, amorphous version of history where human achievement, specifically male achievement, just happens organically, erasing the builder from the narrative entirely.
The book argues that if you erase the verb to build, you are already halfway to erasing the memory of the builder.
It's a very potent point.
I was struck by how this linguistic policing even bleeds into the hard sciences. The book shares a story about a physicist whose research paper was rejected by the prestigious journal Nature in 2022.
Oh, this one is crazy.
The paper wasn't flagged for bad math or flawed methodology or faulty data. It was rejected because the author used the word discovery. The editorial board allegedly claimed that the word discovery carried colonialist overtones.
Which is a perfect illustration of the author's concept of linguistic catabolism. When scientific language is no longer permitted to describe objective reality, but is instead required to enforce a specific political ideology, the civilization begins to digest its own nervous system.
That's a great way to put it.
You lose the ability to communicate basic facts if the words required to state those facts are deemed inherently hateful or colonialist. It paralyzes the pursuit of truth.
The author also brings up this incredibly vivid, almost surreal image from the protests in Portland. The text describes a situation where statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were torn down. These were men who, within the book's framework, helped lay the philosophical and literal groundwork for the civilization that provides us with electricity, running water, and free speech. And what were those statues replaced with?
A sign.
Cardboard sign that read, "Decolonize the grid."
The author openly mocks this phrase as performative immaterialism. He asks the reader to seriously consider what decolonize the grid even means in any practical physical sense.
How do you decolonize alternating current?
Exactly. To him, it is the intellectual equivalent of demanding that we abolish gravity. It sounds deep and righteous to a very specific subculture, but it builds absolutely nothing. It is described as a ritual of rage that metabolizes existing infrastructure and competence and replaces it with empty, self-congratulatory slogans that cannot keep the lights on.
So if I'm tracking the argument here, by removing words like merit or policing casual language like using the word guys or erasing active verbs from historical accounts, the system is making it literally impossible to form the coherent thoughts necessary to defend Western civilization.
Because if you don't have the vocabulary, you can't construct the argument.
That is the core of the linguistic thesis. And if we look at where this reprogramming begins, it inevitably points to the education system. This leads us into a massive analysis of what the book calls the academic purge and the death of meritocracy.
Right. Let's look at the boy crisis in early education.
The book claims that from the very earliest ages, the modern school system is structurally designed to pathologize natural male behavior.
Traits like physical action, a need for movement, and a drive for competition are treated as behavioral disorders that need to be corrected. Meanwhile, female typical behaviors like extended physical stillness, verbal fluency at an early age, and emotional performance are rewarded as the gold standard of being a good student.
The text provides a deeply troubling anecdote of a third-grade classroom. In this specific case, a group of boys was denied their recess time because of excessive movement during a lesson.
Which is just wild for an 8-year-old.
Instead of being allowed to go outside and burn off that physical energy, they were instructed to sit cross-legged and breathe through their frustration.
Wow.
In that exact same environment, girls who cried out of frustration during a math test were given physical comfort, hugs from the teacher, and extra time to complete the assignment.
The author argues this double standard is not accidental. He says it is engineered to produce a specific type of compliant, emotionally volatile adult who is entirely dependent on external validation from an authority figure.
And the macro-level data brought in to support this is genuinely alarming. The book points to the Flynn effect, which is the documented historical rise in IQ scores throughout the 20th century.
Right, scores always went up.
But that effect is not only stalling out in Western nations, it is actually reversing. IQ scores are dropping. And the demographic that is declining the fastest within that data set, young boys.
This raises a critical question about the environment we are placing these boys in. The author answers this by pointing to a 2022 study published in the Journal of Educational Psychology. The researchers found that boys who were placed in gender-neutral, highly ideologically driven classrooms showed an 18% lower engagement rate and a massive 23% higher dropout rate in STEM subjects compared to historical baselines.
23% higher dropout. That's a huge margin.
The book concludes that the attempt to erase masculinity doesn't liberate boys from gender roles, it actively cripples their development. Schools, according to this view, are no longer teaching boys the skills to lead, build, or invent.
They are teaching them to sit down, remain quiet, and if they fail to comply with that unnatural stillness, they are often medicated into submission.
And as those students age up into the university level, the book argues that institutional mediocrity has been completely normalized to protect this new ideology.
There is a deep dive into how universities are actively dismantling the concept of meritocracy. Why? Because objective merit naturally produces unequal outcomes. Some people are just better at math or work harder at writing, but the new ideology views any unequal outcome as prima facie evidence of systemic bias that must be eradicated.
The text cites Yale's recent equity in grading policy as a prime example of this phenomenon in action.
Right.
According to the book's analysis, this policy allows for final marks to be automatically adjusted downward for students who are deemed to dominate class discussions.
Just for talking too much.
Yes. The author points out that this mechanism specifically targets high-achieving, highly confident males who naturally lean into debate and verbal competition. If you speak too often or if your contributions overshadow your peers, your grade is actively penalized to level the playing field.
The book calls this the institutionalization of mediocrity. It's a system designed to silence competence so that less engaged or less capable students are protected from feeling inadequate.
The book also looks at how this operates at the admissions level. It claims that Columbia and several other Ivy League institutions are quietly implementing caps on male admissions to maintain a strict gender balance on campus.
This is happening despite the fact that boys are consistently scoring higher on standardized logic and math tests, like the SAT, and because of that performance gap, the SAT itself is now under fire for alleged gender bias.
I love the analogy the author uses here.
Oh, it's great. He says accusing the SAT of being a rigged test simply because boys score higher on it is like accusing a stopwatch of being racist because one runner crosses the finish line faster than the other.
The rejection of objective reality reaches a kind of fever pitch in the book's example of a Harvard law student. This student published a widely circulated paper claiming that the discipline of mathematics itself is inherently racist because it demands objective, fixed answers.
The logic presented in the paper was that demanding a definitive answer like stating that 2 + 2 = 4 is a relic of white supremacy and patriarchal control that completely ignores subjective lived experiences.
The author uses this specific incident to demonstrate that the catabolic field views objectivity as a form of oppression and treats the insistence on empirical truth as an act of violence.
So what happens to the academics who refuse to play along with this? The book documents what it calls the purge of the professors.
A major focal point is the case of Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College.
Yes. Weinstein was a tenured, highly respected biology professor. He was forced out of his job, doxxed, and physically threatened by roaming mobs of students. And his crime. He simply questioned the logical premise of a day of absence event that demanded all white faculty and students physically leave the campus for a day.
The text also brings up Professor Beth Ann Fennelly at UC Santa Cruz, who was allegedly removed from her position for assigning the poetry of T.S. Eliot to her literature class.
Just for assigning poetry.
The formal complaint against her was that reading T.S. Eliot brought dead white male energy into the curriculum, which made students feel unsafe. Furthermore, an audit of syllabi at Arizona State University's Department of Women's Studies revealed reading lists featuring Maoist manifestos and radical separatist texts, paired with assignments instructing students on how to disrupt patriarchal epistemologies.
Let's pause on that word for a second. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge itself, how we know what is true and what constitutes a valid fact. If I'm understanding Riker correctly, they aren't just teaching students a different version of history. They are actively teaching students to disrupt the very concept of knowing what is true.
The author draws a stark contrast between classical education and this modern framework. Historically, Western education was grounded in the trivium.
Right.
The trivium consists of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. If we think of building a house, grammar provides the raw materials, logic provides the architectural blueprint to ensure the structure won't collapse, and rhetoric is the actual construction process that presents the finished house to the world.
The book argues that universities have abandoned the trivium. In its place, they have installed an indoctrination machine that mints a victim hierarchy.
In this new system, moral authority is no longer granted by wisdom, achievement, or the ability to construct a logical argument. Authority is granted purely by the number of oppressed identities a person can stack together. The author views the modern university not as a place of learning, but as a seminary of guilt.
Right, so instead of teaching you how to think, the university is teaching you what you should feel guilty about based entirely on the circumstances of your birth. And then these university students graduate. They take this exact ideological framework and they carry it straight into the workforce,
Which brings us to a massive shift in the book, focusing on the corporate capture.
which the author attributes heavily to what he terms the female gossip network, particularly centralized within human resources departments.
This is undoubtedly one of the most provocative analytical sections of the text. The author relies on data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics showing that women currently make up 73% of HR roles in America. 73%. The central thesis here is that HR departments have ceased to be neutral administrative bodies focused on payroll and benefits. Instead, they have morphed into ideological gatekeepers tasked with redistributing power and policing thought within the corporate structure.
Here's where the book pulls in some fascinating behavioral science. The author leans heavily on the research of evolutionary psychologist David Buss to explain the underlying mechanics of how modern HR operates.
Buss's research suggests that throughout human evolutionary history, going back to hunter-gatherer societies on the savanna women, developed an incredibly high sensitivity to social exclusion and reputation management.
Because they were physically smaller, direct physical confrontation was incredibly dangerous. So they utilized gossip, reputation destruction, and social ostracization as primary tools for social cohesion and conflict resolution.
The text argues that modern HR policies have essentially taken this ancient evolutionary survival trait and formalized it into corporate law.
In the modern office environment, female social vigilance has been transformed into institutional control. Gossip is codified as corporate policy. Shaming is elevated to a formal disciplinary procedure.
The author likens the modern hostile work environment complaint to a digital stoning. To ruin a career, you no longer necessarily need hard, empirical evidence of a broken contract or a violated law. You simply need a critical mass of voices declaring that someone made them feel unsafe.
The book uses the Aziz Ansari controversy as the ultimate cultural touchstone for this dynamic. If you recall that situation, Ansari went on a date. By all accounts, including the accusers, it was a consensual date.
Right, there's no physical coercion.
No force, no police report filed, and no legal complaint made. But a pseudonymous blog post was published by the woman, detailing her internal feelings of emotional discomfort and awkwardness during the date.
That subjective narrative was enough to trigger a massive digital firing squad. Within 48 hours, the global media and the public treated Ansari as a convicted predator.
The author uses the Ansari case to demonstrate what he sees as a Marxist reversal of the burden of proof. It completely replaces the foundational Western legal principle of innocent until proven guilty with a new standard, guilty until disproven.
And it is a conviction driven entirely by narrative. The text argues this is rooted in a feminist epistemology that treats female emotion as incontrovertible, empirical truth, while simultaneously viewing any attempt by a man to defend himself as further proof of his inherent toxicity and guilt.
In the book's framework, the popular slogan, "Believe all women," is not a plea for fairness. It is the ultimate satanic inversion of the justice system.
And the book brings in hard economic data to show how this ideology impacts the everyday worker on the ground. There is a citation of a 2022 study by the IZA Institute of Labor Economics, which found that female-led HR departments are 400% more likely to fire male employees for alleged toxic behavior that is based entirely on subjective, non-quantifiable metrics.
Metrics like vocal tone, facial expressions, or office gossip. We aren't talking about missing sales quotas or failing performance metrics. If a man speaks too firmly in a meeting or fails to modulate his tone, he is labeled toxic. The author explicitly refers to this dynamic as maternal policing.
The text argues that this creates a pervasive workplace atmosphere where rational, data-driven argument is routinely dismissed as verbal aggression. If empirical data contradicts the emotional consensus of the room, the data is ignored.
The result, according to the book, is a corporate culture populated by emasculated men who are terrified of stepping out of line, governed by empowered women who rule through emotional fiat. This dynamic leads directly to the massive, unchecked expansion of the DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion industrial complex.
Let's drill down into the DEI complex, because the book gives some brutal examples of how this prioritizes ideology over actual physical public safety.
There is an account of male firefighters in California who were terminated, not because they failed their physical fitness tests, and not because they were incompetent in a burning building. They were let go simply to open up positions to meet newly mandated female hiring quotas.
The author argues that the state is literally willing to sacrifice emergency response capabilities and public safety just to satisfy a demographic spreadsheet.
The book also details the story of a male software coder working at a Google facility in Boise. This coder was mandated to attend an inclusive leadership program.
During this program, he was formally reprimanded because his intense focus on meeting project deadlines was deemed emotionally oppressive to his teammates.
And his preference for giving direct, unvarnished feedback was labeled as aggressively masculine. The very traits that made him a highly effective, productive engineer were suddenly pathologized as a workplace hazard.
The resolution to that story is fascinating. What did he do? He chose to walk away.
He quit Google, left the tech industry entirely, and now works in a converted warehouse teaching welding to teenage boys.
And the book notes that the man reports his cortisol levels have plummeted, his marriage has vastly improved, and he feels a profound sense of peace because he's no longer forced to apologize for being useful.
The author uses this narrative to underscore the idea that men are fundamentally healthier when they are engaged in real responsibility building physical things, leading, protecting, rather than being trapped in HR-defined safe spaces where their natural ambition is treated like a disease.
This corporate capture, driven by identity politics and HR bureaucracy, is presented as a perfect functioning manifestation of the catabolic field. Every single hour that a company spends forcing its employees through a DEI training module is an hour not spent innovating, coding, or solving actual problems.
The system actively consumes the real capital, time, and talent of the corporation to fuel the illusion of moral progress. If the workplace is where this ideology regulates your ambition and your speech, the legal system is where it regulates your actual freedom and your family.
The book paints a pretty grim picture of how these exact same principles bleed into family courts and the justice system, making the case that the law has been transformed into a blunt instrument of social control, specifically targeting men.
The analysis begins with a family court system, presenting a raft of data showing that men lose primary custody of their children in over 80% of contested cases, even in situations where the parenting records, income, and stability are demonstrably equal.
The author argues this systemic bias is based on an unwritten, entirely unscientific dogma that inherently assumes women are natural, safe nurturers, while men are viewed as inherent risks to the child's well-being.
There is a chilling specific case study out of Oregon. A father was legally denied custody of his young son specifically because he refused to consent to sending the boy to a clinic for a gender exploration workshop.
The presiding judge officially labeled the father as emotionally rigid and unsupportive. So, in the eyes of the state, a man attempting to protect his child from what he views as ideological indoctrination is legally deemed an unfit parent.
The book also examines Canada's Bill C-16, which controversially added gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act. The author recounts a horrific, highly publicized incident where a biological male gained access to a women-only abuse shelter and raped a female resident.
Because of the framework of gender identity laws, the attacker claimed the legal right to identify as female. The resulting violent crime was legally recorded and reclassified by the state as a same-sex assault.
The author states that the sheer reality of this should hit the reader like a physical blow. The legal system went out of its way to protect the chosen identity of the predator while completely silencing and rewriting the physical reality of the female victim.
In the book's view, this proves that the catabolic field doesn't even care about protecting women. It will gladly dismantle the very concept of womanhood if it serves the higher ideology.
It's just staggering to think about the legal system actively rewriting a crime to protect a narrative, and then the text tackles the #MeToo movement, viewing it through this same critical lens.
The book points out that the movement didn't start organically with a brave victim taking the stand in a court of law to provide sworn testimony. It started as a digital hashtag.
And the author notes the background of Tarana Burke, the activist who originally coined the phrase, pointing out her past employment as an assistant to a convicted sex trafficker. The argument here is that the movement bypassed the justice system entirely and turned the act of accusation itself into a source of absolute, unchecked power.
To support this claim, the text notes that Google search trends for the specific phrase, how to accuse someone of harassment, spiked by 400% in the months immediately following the mainstreaming of the hashtag in 2017.
The author interprets this data not as an organic outpouring of delayed justice, but as a strategic, widespread gaming of the system.
The cultural lesson was clear. Women were taught that the act of accusation grants immediate social power and victim status, and men were taught that their only survival strategy was to remain silent and compliant.
And the psychological toll this environment has taken on young men is severe. The book cites polling showing that 68% of male college students now report that they fear false accusations more than they fear physical crime or debilitating illness.
This environment of legal peril and social suspicion leads directly into the author's philosophical critique of what he calls the happiness cult and the total collapse of the institution of marriage.
He focuses heavily on Scandinavia, specifically zeroing in on Denmark. Denmark consistently ranks number 1 or 2 in global happiness indexes. But the book frames it completely differently, calling Denmark a dystopian laboratory of feminist social engineering.
The text points out the stark reality beneath the happiness metrics. Denmark has a massive 46% divorce rate.
To illustrate the cultural mindset that drives this statistical fracture, the author shares the detailed stories of 2 specific Danish women. The first, Line Sørensen, legally dissolved her marriage and left her 2 young children to travel to a yoga retreat in Bali in order to find herself.
The book describes her posting photos of avocado toast on social media with captions like, "Finally happy," while her children were left behind to be managed by her ex-husband and the state apparatus.
The second story involves a woman named Mette Jensen, who chose to abort her 3rd child simply because she felt a 3rd pregnancy would ruin her curated Instagram aesthetic and limit her travel options, posting a selfie shortly after the procedure, calling herself free and fabulous.
The author uses these deeply personal stories to argue that modern feminism operates as a form of emotional vampirism. It elevates brief, transient dopamine spikes and the endless pursuit of personal female happiness far above concepts like duty, family building, and the creation of legacy.
We constantly see UN campaigns with slogans like "Happy Women, Happy World," but the book notes a dark irony. Female happiness within this specific cultural framework often spikes highest during the initiation of divorce and the active destruction of the family unit, rather than during the difficult sacrificial work of building it.
The book explicitly labels this phenomenon as demographic warfare. With abortion rates in Scandinavia sitting at roughly 1 in 4 pregnancies, and the overall Western fertility rate dropping perilously below the replacement level of 2.1, now hovering down below 1.5, the author argues that the West is literally eating its own future.
The ideology, in his view, teaches young women that children are an oppressive burden, that traditional motherhood is a form of unpaid slavery, and that abortion is the ultimate act of liberation. The author counters this entire worldview by posing a profound question. What if children and family are actually the ultimate enduring form of wealth and meaning in a human life?
And the cost of this societal pivot toward personal happiness falls disproportionately on the children, particularly young boys.
The book brings in Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development data showing that fatherless children are 3 times more likely to drop out of high school, 5 times more likely to commit suicide, and an astonishing 6 times more likely to end up in the prison system.
But as the author points out, if you were to state those statistics aloud in a university faculty lounge or post them on LinkedIn, you would likely be canceled or disciplined.
The system is perfectly designed to pathologize the silent, grieving men who lose their families. But it fiercely resists ever auditing the happiness or the moral responsibility of the women who initiate the fracturing of those homes.
Which brings us to a vital structural mechanism of how this entire ideology maintains its dominance and shields itself from this exact kind of criticism. The book provides a fascinating and deeply concerning breakdown of Silicon Valley's infrastructure, labeling it a digital panopticon governed by the media mind virus and tech censorship.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The breakdown of algorithmic bias is wild. Let's look at how the book analyzes Microsoft and the development of artificial intelligence.
The author explains that tech giants like Microsoft have trained their AI content moderation models using massive data sets derived almost exclusively from feminist sociology papers, gender studies journals, and Marxist psychology research.
Because the AI is trained on this specific ideological data, it inherently pathologizes natural male traits at the code level. In the system's eyes, an expression of competitiveness is automatically flagged as toxic. Assertiveness is categorized as verbal aggression. The desire for leadership is labeled as dominance.
To prove this point, the text cites a 2022 MIT study that tested these AI content moderation systems across major platforms like Facebook and Twitter. The researchers fed the AI identical, highly aggressive arguments. One prompt was written from the perspective of a man vigorously defending male-only spaces, and the other prompt was written from the perspective of a woman attacking men with the exact same level of aggressive language.
The result: the AI flagged the male defending himself as hate speech 47% more often than the female prompt. The algorithm wasn't detecting the presence of violence or aggression, it was detecting gender. And it algorithmically punished the male voice simply for being male.
It's literally systemic discrimination baked into the source code of the internet. And it profoundly affects the culture and content we're allowed to consume. Look at how the book analyzes Amazon's content moderation.
In 2020, Amazon quietly removed a children's book titled Men Are Stronger. It wasn't a political manifesto. It was a simple, illustrated story about a young boy learning to lift weights in the garage with his dad.
There was no violence, no derogatory language, and no customer complaints. It was just a positive depiction of physical male strength, and it was wiped from the store.
Meanwhile, as the author points out, the young adult bestseller lists are absolutely saturated with books glorifying teenage girls acting as warlords, assassins, and ruling the world through violence.
The book documents Apple engaging in the exact same curation practices within its App Store. The author notes that Apple rejected an application called Stoic Dad, which was a health and wellness app designed to help men manage daily stress through journaling prompts based on the principles of Marcus Aurelius and Roman Stoicism.
The official reason provided for the rejection: Apple claimed the app glorified male dominance. Yet concurrently, Apple greenlit and hosted an app called Riker, which literally features mechanics encouraging women to scream into their phone's microphone to score points and provides templates to send anonymous hate text to their ex-boyfriends.
And Spotify. The book points out that Spotify actively curates and pushes playlists to its global home screen with titles like Female Rage and Smash the Patriarchy. They elevate this anger as high art, but they completely ignore the statistical reality of male suffering.
The text drops some incredibly heavy statistics here. Men make up nearly 80% of all suicides, and they account for 93% of all workplace fatalities. It is difficult to reconcile the idea of universal oppressive male privilege with a statistic like 93% of workplace deaths. But Spotify doesn't promote men-at-risk playlists to foster empathy. They promote female rage anthems to offset a perceived imbalance of power.
The author then details the outright deplatforming strategies used by big tech to silence dissenters. The book revisits the moment Patreon notoriously defunded Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Peterson's account was terminated simply because he engaged in a philosophical debate about the ethics of compelled speech and pronoun usage.
Yet Patreon continues to allow and process funding for creators who are actively developing feminist video games with literal titles like Kill All Men.
The analysis of TikTok is even more insidious because of how hidden it is. The author claims to have run tests indicating that TikTok utilizes hidden social justice alignment scores to track a creator's ideological compliance on the back end.
If a male creator posts videos promoting traditional duty, stoic self-control, or the importance of being a strong, present father, his organic reach is artificially throttled, and his account is quietly demonetized without explanation.
Similarly, the book points out that Twitter, prior to its recent change in ownership, engaged in highly surgical shadow banning. The text notes instances where male psychologists attempted to post threads discussing the reality of male disposability, highlighting that 93% workplace death statistic, and those threads were quietly killed by the algorithm.
The authors received no notifications, no ban alerts. Their reach was simply reduced to zero. Meanwhile, activist accounts posting inflammatory statements like, "Men are an endangered species and that's a good thing," received algorithmic viral boosts and blue check verification.
The book suggests that these platforms have evolved past the need for loud public bans. They don't just ban men, they make them practically invisible.
They starve the defense of oxygen and reach, while simultaneously funding the destruction of traditional norms through massive ad revenue sharing. It's described as a self-policing digital thought prison designed to funnel men into a state of silence, shame, and eventual submission.
However, the narrative shifts significantly as we examine the final sections of the text. The author argues that the catabolic field has vastly overreached its mandate. Men are waking up to the reality of the system.
The book outlines what it calls the male revolt and the Western rebirth, and it anchors this optimism in a 2023 Pew study showing that 70% of men under the age of 30 say they no longer trust the mainstream media to tell the truth.
And the book makes a crucial point here. They aren't distrustful because they've been brainwashed by fringe internet conspiracies. They are distrustful because they're guided by hard data, their own biology, and their daily lived reality.
They see the rigged game with their own eyes. They see the education system failing them, the legal system punishing them for wanting to be fathers, and the therapeutic industry trying to medicate their natural instincts out of existence. So what is the logical response? They are organizing entirely outside the system.
The author details the rapid rise of the digital underground. Men are abandoning mainstream platforms and forming highly active parallel networks on private Discord servers, encrypted Telegram groups, and flocking to independent substacks like The Mithrillion and The Rational Male.
They are actively, consciously rejecting the ideology of the Catabolic field. They are trading mandatory corporate DEI seminars for the meditations of Marcus Aurelius.
They are rejecting the kind of modern therapy that tells them their masculinity is toxic and replacing it with the brutal physical truth of weightlifting, building themselves up physically and mentally to withstand the culture.
This underground movement is how the book contextualizes the explosive Andrew Tate phenomenon. While acknowledging the immense controversy surrounding him, the author argues that Tate's staggering 8.5 billion views do not stem from a sudden societal embrace of misogyny.
Rather, the text posits that those views stem from a desperate, deep starvation among young men for any source of truth regarding discipline, physical strength, and unapologetic masculinity.
Young boys are exhausted by being constantly told that their natural instincts are psychiatric disorders. Tate, regardless of his massive personal flaws, gained traction because he was one of the few voices telling young men to stop whining, to build something of value, and to earn their place in the world through competence.
So, given this massive diagnosis of the problem, what does the author tell these men to actually do about it? What is the call to action, the war manual for navigating this catabolic field?
The book provides very specific, actionable instructions. First, live rightly. The author tells men to be the man their grandfather would have respected and the man their father wanted to raise.
He urges men to define their masculinity through their own tangible actions, iron discipline, and fierce loyalty to their families, completely ignoring the definitions handed down by a corporate HR department or a gender studies professor.
Second, speak with absolute precision and logic. The text specifically advises men to wield ridicule as a weapon against woke dogma. The argument is that this ideology is incredibly fragile. It cannot withstand humor or mockery, and it rapidly collapses when its internal contradictions are exposed to the daylight of common sense.
And third, the directive is to build outside the rot. Support the truth wherever you find it. Form private, resilient networks. Start independent businesses that don't rely on ESG funding. Build strong, traditional families grounded in biological reality, not ideological compliance.
The overarching message is clear. If the mainstream institutions, the universities, the corporations, the media, are determined to catabolize themselves, leave them to their fate. Walk away and build parallel structures that value merit and strength.
To synthesize this entire expansive deep dive, Conrad Riker's book presents a highly detailed, intensely red-pilled diagnosis of our modern cultural framework.
The core thesis is that a toxic synthesis of feminism, Marxism, and postmodernism has generated a catabolic field that is actively, deliberately consuming the moral, intellectual, and structural capital of Western civilization.
The book argues that this system achieves its power by pathologizing natural masculinity, erasing the concept of objective truth from language and law, and replacing the pursuit of merit with a rigid hierarchy of victimhood.
It is a massive, relentless, and unflinching critique of the modern world. And it leaves us with a profound philosophical question to chew on as we wrap up. I want to leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought.
If, as the book suggests happening right now, an entire generation of capable, competent men decides to simply stop participating in the corporate, academic, and social systems that currently govern them,
If they opt out of HR-managed Fortune 500 corporations and equity-graded Ivy League universities to build their own parallel structures in the digital and physical underground, what does the future of those mainstream institutions actually look like? Can a society or a corporate structure or university system actually survive if its primary builders, innovators, and problem solvers quietly decide to just walk away?
it truly is a question of civilizational endurance. If the healthy muscle actively removes itself from the body, what happens to the organism left behind?
It's a lot to think about, and the implications are staggering. Thank you for joining us on this massive journey today. Please do not forget to take a second to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive.
We strongly encourage you to head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Satanic, Catabolic Field, Feminist, Marxist, Postmodernist, Woke Mind, Virus Field Phenomena, Killing Western Civilization by Conrad Riker, so you can read these fascinating in-depth arguments and dive into the data for yourself.
And remember to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to stay up to date with his ongoing analysis, essays, and writing on these topics. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.